Welcome back here to Wake Up Call with Dan Tortora inside of the Cafe Kubal studios. Happy to be here with you every Monday through Friday from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Cafe Kubal on 3501 James Street, 324 West Water Street, 401 South Salina Street in Syracuse, 343 Fayette Street in Manlius, and on the corner of Route 11 and Taft Road at Sweetheart Corners in North Syracuse, New York, and their drive-through. Here with me, picture in picture, is no stranger to the broadcast. We've known each other since before there was a name and a logo to this conference. The American Athletic Conference Commissioner, Mike Aresco, arm in arm back in the day in Newport, Rhode Island. They're down in Irving, Texas now. A little bit warmer, maybe a little less lobster. We'll talk with him about it. Mike, how you doing today?
How are you, Dan? And it is warm. It's in the 80s again. This is not New England fall weather. Let's put it that way. But yeah, we moved here, as you know, a few years ago. It made more sense. We're nearer to our schools. Yeah. But you alluded to the Lobster Fest that we used to have in Newport, and we have done away with that. Unfortunately, that's not our region anymore, and it was also a very expensive undertaking, I must say. And with COVID, of course, we couldn't do it for several years anyway. So after that, we decided that we'd probably want to. We've been doing some of those meetings virtually, or some of our media days, as you know, and we're going to start doing them in person again, but probably in our area here. But always great to be with you. And you're right. We get hard to believe. I was Big East commissioner for a year, and then when Catholic schools left, everything fell apart. We got raided by the Big Ten and by others. There was no choice but to try to rebuild, and it was controversial giving up the Big East name because it had built up a lot of equity over 40 years, whatever it was, and that was no small thing. On the other hand, we had to make some trade-offs, and we needed, there was a lot of revenue at stake, and we needed that because we weren't going to get the kind of TV deal that we wanted, and it helped our schools at least do what they needed to do to try to pay coaches a little more, to try to do some things to better themselves, and so consequently. The name has helped them a lot, but it was much more a basketball brand than it was a football brand. And as you know, we came up with Americans. I think it's been a durable name and a good logo. And, the conference has succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. We've been the victim of our own success, losing the three teams because they've been so successful and our league's been so successful. So that's the way the chips fall, Dan.
Yeah, it's been an interesting road, and I just celebrated my 10-year anniversary.
Congratulations!
Thank you. July 20th of 2012, and so to now, and so I know that with my 10-year coming up, the 10-year for the American on its way as well, because I said, and I'll never forget this, and I was speaking with somebody else in the media here a little bit earlier this week. When I said this, I said I'll never forget the day that I met Mike Aresco, and we were talking to each other, introduced myself, and we were in Newport, Rhode Island, arm in arm. I said, I put my arm around him, and I said, from one red-headed stepchild to the next, we're going to build this thing together. So seeing that now, 10 years for my company, 10 years coming up here for the American, just what that means to you to look back on a decade and to know that you were building something in that moment, and me as well. And I just find it to be an incredible parallel when you get to professionally and personally get to see someone that you care about, and something that you care about kind of just be right there with you through the whole step of the way. When I have an anniversary, so does the American, so to speak.
Well, first of all, we appreciated your interest in the league, because not everyone had the same interest in us or thought we would be nationally relevant. And I think you gave us a shot early on. We had a few writers that did, but not everyone. So we kind of grew up together, and we're very pleased with, you and I have been friends now, and you've covered us for years. You're knowledgeable, our league. And so it's been a nice parallel thing. Now, when it comes to our league, Dan, it's right now it's a little bittersweet. We're losing some important schools, but on the other hand, I view this as just the evolution of college sports. Unfortunately, you have to accept it, and you can't take it personally at all. I'm very pleased with what they've done in the league. If I were them, I'd probably be doing the same thing. They stand now to earn, $40 to $50 million annually. They go into a league that is a so-called P5 league. We've worked hard to be a P6 league, which I think we earned. unfortunately, we have bureaucratic hurdles, and we were probably, I think, ready to finally overcome them. And then all of a sudden, the Texas-Oklahoma earthquake hit, and we lost the 3 teams. But I'm very proud of what this league has done for 10 years. I mean, there's no question that the decade has been spectacular. Going to 7 out of 9 New Year's Day games, 7 out of, think about that. And we're competing with 65 other schools. And, we had one year we had an automatic BCS appearance, but we would have won it anyway because we had an 11-1 UCF team that, by the way, beat Baylor when they were, I think, number 5 in the country in the Fiesta Bowl. Our very first year, Dan. Very first year, we won the Fiesta Bowl. We won the national championship in basketball with UConn, the women's national championship with UConn. We had, some success in other sports. Think about that. And people called us a mid-major. Some do, most don't, but that's ridiculous. Mid-majors don't do that, and then not only that, in no time, a few years later, Houston beats Florida State in the Peach Bowl, UCF beats Auburn in the Peach Bowl. We have, we're appearing in the Fiesta Bowl, and we play competitively in all those games. And then finally, to cap it off, Cincinnati makes the playoff in our league. They did it in our league, and it's almost something that most people said couldn't happen. The G5 just wasn't ever going to get a team. So I'm immensely proud of it. And the fact is, I tip my cap to the 3 that are leaving. They did a great job investing. They did a great job in the conference. But on the other hand, they're not irreplaceable brands, and that's not to knock them. But they're not Texas and Oklahoma or USC, UCLA. And we're bringing in UTSA and UAB and FAU and some really good schools. North Texas invests heavily. Rice is coming on. You see them putting out a pretty good product on the field. So we're going to be fine. But it's definitely bittersweet to do that. We just didn't have the revenue to keep them, and we didn't have ultimately the cachet of that so-called P5, which I don't think even should exist anymore. It's P2 and everybody else as far as I'm concerned right now.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. American Athletic Conference Commissioner Mike Aresco here on Wake Up Call with Dan Tortora inside of the Cafe Kubal studios here this morning with you all, and appreciate you being here on a Friday as we get to celebrate the weekend coming up. But yeah, I mean, this you said P2 and everybody else. I prognosticated it probably the beginning of the pandemic. Well, I've been talking about autonomy for a while because autonomy by definition means self-governing. And then ACC Commissioner John Swofford and I had multiple conversations where I sat down with him and said, okay, so you, the Pac-12, the Big 10, the Big 12, and the SEC, you're all autonomy is autonomous conferences when it comes down to the legislative term, not the media term of Power 5. And I said, what that means is self-governing. You have a separate set of rules. You have different things you could do in full cost of attendance and these different pieces that were implemented in recruiting and whatnot. Is there ever going to be a time where you could walk away because on paper, legally, you're self-governing? And so John Swofford told me on multiple occasions, it's not out of the realm of possibility. Not right now, but it's not as if they hadn't talked about it. Fast forward to Oklahoma, Texas, years later after I talked with John Swofford about this, and I say, okay, the SEC can arguably leave right now with Greg Sankey and the crew, and they would have 16 teams, almost 20, if they don't try to take a few more to get to 20, form their own league and call it a day. The Big 10, in response to that, takes USC and UCLA out of the Pac-12 and looks to maybe join the SEC in this Power 2. Mike, from talking about the autonomy group in the beginning to saying 5 years ago, 5 to 10 years from now, the NCAA won't exist. And if it does, it's not going to look the same. All of these predictions that I've kind of put forward in the last 5 years, they're starting to come to life. I don't know if I'm happy about the fact that there's all this disbanding, but I saw the writing on the wall. How do you feel about the fact that the NCAA is changing? They're figuring out their identity. The college football playoff is looking to expand, but it also has an end date on what it had been doing. Notre Dame has been trying to figure things out. The Big 10, the SEC have expanded. The Big 12 had to get creative, and they did that with the American. You had to get creative with Conference USA. Once again, the Sun Belt is expanding. I feel like we're living in a world where Division I football, FBS, is not going to be just one group of conferences. I get a feeling there's going to be layers to this thing. And I know I threw a lot at you right now, but I'd love to get your thoughts.
Well, Dan, first of all, what we're fighting for is actually the idea that there are 10 FBS conferences and they should all be treated equally. They're not all equal. We know that. We know that everybody has their own strengths and weaknesses, and we know that all FBS conferences are not created equal. On the other hand, equality is an important concept. Treat them the same. By the way, the CFP has now done that, and that's really important. It's 6-6. It's 6 conferences. It doesn't say 5+1. It doesn't say that the G5 are separate. In fact, we're hoping that the G5 name goes away. A very important initiative for us is to get rid of the so-called P5, G5, and just FBS. Now, the media is going to continue to use P5. They're doing it. And they'll say, well, Big 12 just got $380 million. You guys are far less, even though we have a nice TV deal relative to the other G4. But they'll say, and they'll still refer to us that way. Now, we think officially, though, we may be able to get rid of that label. In the new CFP revenue distribution, we just want it to be calibrated by FBS conferences. We think we're in the middle somewhere. And we think we always were, right? The second thing is, you kind of alluded to it, FBS breakaway, or at one time it was the so-called P5 breakaway. That's not happening. The P5 recognize they don't want to do that. And they don't want to get into any of the antitrust issues. They don't want to get into any of that. And yes, now they view themselves differently. They have this autonomy. Dan, I'm not really sure what autonomy is going to mean once the transformation committee of the NCAA finishes its work, because it's allowing people to do things that, the autonomy fellows needed that privileged status to do. You're not going to need that anymore. So therefore, I'm not even sure autonomy means anything. They'll like it because it gives them a certain cachet, and that's important, certain branding. Branding is critical. I fully appreciate branding because it's hurt us, this notion that we're in the G5. Sometimes, the media just talks about the P5, well, top coaches in the P5, top teams in the P5. And it irritates me no end because it's all FBS, and we've been as good as several of those P5 conferences over the years. We have a winning record against the Pac-12. We've done a lot of great things, as you know. We've easily been a P6. We should have been a P6. We probably were on the cusp, these 3 teams, and that's just the way it is. There's a pecking order in college sports. And, you mentioned the changes in college sports and alluded to the realignment. It's almost becoming Darwinian. It's predatory. I mean, you just look at it. Yeah. We crossed a Rubicon in a way with UCLA and USF going to, UCF, USC. I guess you have your own team on your mind. Going to the Big Ten. Now, it's a great thing for the Big Ten, and I'm not going to criticize it because that's where we're going these days. But no one ever dreamed that would happen. The Pac-12 had been around for 100 years, whatever. Those schools were firmly entrenched in the Pac-12. Oklahoma, Texas, you could see that a little more because, culturally they're very similar in the way they emphasize football. They're in contiguous states. They look a lot like SEC schools in the way they approach football and everything. Okay, I get that. But the ACC gobbled up the Big East. It was happening before. It just didn't get the same attention that it gets now. Yeah. So there's been this issue of, people going after other schools because one, the TV money became huge and it all became dependent on football. Those who saw that, and I commend Commissioner Swafford. I mean, look, it hurt our league. It all happened pretty much before I got to the Big East, but he understood that football was going to drive this. It wasn't going to be basketball. I mean, basketball can help, but it's not going to drive it. Yeah. And so you've seen realignment now change college sports forever in a way. The consolidation is real. I don't know how much more will occur. Like junior high school, teams want to be part of the cool kids club, so it's not even a question of money. For some, money drives a lot of it, of course, but it's even more than that. Prestige, it's, the playoff expanding to 12 teams, Dan, allows all those teams in those 2 major leagues, the Big Ten and the SEC, those dominant leagues with all the big brand names. It allows them now to be in the playoff, even if they don't win that league, or even if maybe they could finish 3rd and still make the playoff potentially because you have 6 at-larges. So that alone, I think, aids in the consolidation. I think if you have that kind of consolidation and you keep a playoff, Dan, at 4 teams, think about that.
Yeah.
Teams are going to get pretty annoyed year after year if they have a really good record.
Yeah.
So now that's changed. And, the money, everybody compares the money. I think what you have to do as a commissioner in this environment is manage expectations. There's no way we're going to be the SEC or the Big Ten. We may not even be the ACC, but we can compete with them, and the point is, if you're the Pac-12 or the Big 12, you're not going to get the kind of money the Big Ten got, but it doesn't matter because you still have plenty of money to work with. And even when we had almost no money, Dan, you saw our evolution. You were there. You saw it. We talked about it all those years. We did it with almost no money because our guys were smart. They hired good coaches. They recruited well. The rules are affecting us now. I don't know where NIL's going. I don't know where the transfer portal's going. I do know that the transfer portal combined with the year in residency disappearing has been the biggest fundamental change. Forget about NIL. It's the year in residency that has changed everything. Because if you can just leave that quickly and you can get that NIL enticement and you don't have to stay, you don't have to worry about stability, anything, then it's going to change everything. So anyway, that, I hope that it gives you an overview. There's so many issues here, that we are wrestling with, pay to play down the road, that overlap and overhang everything we're doing. But for us on a micro level, we're kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop now. Things often play out over a couple of years. And I don't know at this point whether there is or not. But I also know that I do think FBS, for example, will have more self-government, but I don't think we'll necessarily try to take over the NCAA or become the NCAA, because the NCAA has a great brand when it comes to the tournament and the things they manage, right? They don't have such a great brand and everything else. Yeah. But the point is, if they stay and there's an enforcement arm, I don't think we want to get involved in enforcement at the FBS level. We can still, the biggest concern about that was the fact that we often have committees that have a lot of individuals on them that aren't from our FBS world and don't really have an understanding of what we're dealing with or make decisions that are contrary to what we would do. I think we would like to have more self-governance in that regard. Now, we have a lot of it already. The money is all in the CFP. We make our own decisions. We don't have to worry about the NCAA telling us what to do when it comes to that. So a lot of that's already happened. It's just a question of how far is it going to go.
Yeah, and I think with all of these changes that have gone on and all of this realignment and NIL and pay for play and not having to have a year in residency and you can transfer right away in that one-time transfer, all these different things that you just brought up, Mike, how do you feel like there is a central voice, a central body of reason as the transformational committee tries to figure itself out over time? And we know NCAA President Mark Emmert says, hey, I'm stepping down. And before that happens, right at the beginning of COVID, he comes out and says, I have no control over college football. I can't tell a conference when to play or if they're going to play. I can't tell a school if they should play or not. So then people start saying, okay, well, then can you suspend a coach? Can you suspend a student athlete? If you have no control over the conference and the institution, then you have no control over the players and coaches within that conference and institution. So do you feel we're getting to a place where you as a commissioner feel like there is a central bodied voice that everyone can go to, a voice of reason, or are we still lacking a nucleus to collegiate athletics, college football?
Well, it's a good point, and you raise a larger point, and that is not only college football, but just generally college athletics and what's happening. The NCAA has, as you know, taken a hands-off approach to a lot of things recently, in part because of that Supreme Court decision. So we've got some fundamental things to deal with. One, does the NCAA assume its former role in any way? There's going to be a new NCAA president. We don't know, how the transformation committee is going to come out in terms of what they're going to recommend, but they probably are going to recommend more autonomy for individual conferences, more ability to do certain things. And I think in the end, we are going to need some kind of national approach to these problems. The way I view it, I boil it down to NIL, pay to play, the transfer portal, health and safety and enforcement. Now, let's separate out enforcement for the time being, because that's where the NCAA can, like you say, can they suspend somebody? Well, they can tell a program, right, that they have a bowl ban or they have this and that. They don't typically do that anymore, or a basketball ban, but they still have enforcement power, right? Okay, but in terms of NIL, pay to play, maybe coming down the road, we are going to need, in my view, a collective approach nationally. And we have to come up with it. We can't let Congress come up with it, because they're not going to, and if we come up with it and it avoids unionization, it avoids employee status, which we don't want. But we have a group that collectively bargains nationally for if this is where we're going, if it's clear that it's going to be pay to play. I mean, who knows what California is going to do in their next legislative session, right? They started this whole thing. And then I think you go to Congress, and I don't know what the new Congress is going to look like, but the point is you go to Congress and say, we need an antitrust exemption for what we're doing. It's reasonable what we're doing. It's pro-competitive. It helps everyone. It creates uniformity. It takes us out of the realm of this complete, dysfunction and disorganization. Give us the protection we need to do it. Now that's something I think they would consider, because they don't have to necessarily come up with it. And the other thing too, Dan, in terms of this is right now we have, a fragmented system, obviously, but unless you want the rich to get richer and so rich that they dominate everything, which isn't good for anybody. And that's why the playoff is so important, to have 12 teams and to have 6 and 6, because that's probably the only way with the way the SEC and the Big Ten are now structured and the money they are going to have. That's about the only way you stay relevant, right? Long term. If you keep making the playoff, your league will remain relevant. And even if you don't have as much money as the others, you'll be okay. But in terms of collectively bargaining something, it just seems to me that if we bankrupt 75% of our programs, not going to be good for anybody. If 75% of our programs were suddenly irrelevant because the playoffs stayed at 4 teams and SEC and Big Ten had all the brands, that's not good for anyone either. It's not a healthy environment. So consequently, I think we need to try to figure out a way to do it on a national basis if it comes to that. And I was never a proponent of pay to play. Maybe I'm archaic. I really believe that college sports had a certain, forget about the term purity, but it had a certain way of doing things that I thought was good. I'm not really sure that, because NIL is not NIL. It's morphed into something completely different.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that's good for the kids either, who are, worried about whether they got a $500,000 deal and they don't necessarily really deserve it. They have no name recognition, right? It's all recruiting and NIL, the nickname now is now it's legal. That's the acronym, it's not what it was intended to be. It's one thing if Trevor Lawrence could do a national deal because of his name recognition, or Bryce Young. How many guys have that? Very few. But maybe locally somebody could do card shows, or could do, autograph things, or could do camps, or could get a local dealership to, be the face of a local dealer. That's fine. That's what NIL was supposed to do, free you to do the kinds of things students could do. But not, it morphed quickly into the collectives and into, recruiting, retention, basically paying to get players. Now, you could argue maybe some of that stuff was done under the table over the years, and it's one of the unfortunate things that we can't ever prove it, but, we tried to get rid of it. But now it's all basically right there. And sure, there are some guidelines, some, as they say, guideposts, but very few. And you can get around those very easily. So I think any reinforcement of this lacks teeth. The other thing I will say, Dan, and then I know you have other questions. NIL, unless we can devise a fair market value system, and there are companies that determine fair market value, national companies that do that, and get Congress to give us the protection we need, because right now we're getting sued all the time, and it's ridiculous. It's going to bankrupt us. It's too easy to sue us. It's too easy to, say, well, you didn't do this for 10 years, therefore you should pay. Or, well, everybody doesn't do something for a period of time. Everything evolves, right? The country didn't do certain things that it should have done, right? Governments don't do, everybody, you can't keep going back and hitting the NCAA and saying, well, you should have been doing cost of attendance years ago and therefore you weren't. Well, everything evolved, everything developed. We're in a better place now than we were. But these lawsuits are starting to really, really pile up. And I just think in the end, unless we get some protection, if we're doing something that's pro-competitive, that makes perfect sense, because antitrust law isn't supposed to outlaw things that are reasonable. If we can get that protection, but you can't just go to Congress and say, you handle our problems. You become that's a losing proposition. One, it's not going to happen. Two, if it did, you wouldn't like it anyway, right? So anyway, that's where I'm coming from on this.
Yeah, and I think speaking here with American Athletic Conference Commissioner Mike Aresco here on Wake Up Call with Dan Tortora inside of the Cafe Kubal studios this morning, we have the opportunity to really look at this and realize that there were so many problems. And I said this, it was in the middle of a pandemic. You're coming up with these massive changes in collegiate athletics and what amateurism is, if there even is amateurism anymore. And when these things were happening, it was funny because I heard a few months back, I was listening to a channel on Sirius XM, and they said, I was traveling between New York and Pennsylvania, and they said that if anybody knew how bad it was going to be with NIL and the transfer portal and all this, like, could you really raise your hand? And while I was driving in the car, I was like, you can go back and check the tape. You can go back 2 years on Wake Up Call. And I said, here are all the things. And then I came on and said, here are more things, and kept making, and my list got bigger. My questions were larger. And I always get very concerned. And as a business owner, as a CEO, as somebody who is chasing after my dreams every single day, I find it incredibly important, Mike, to be in a place where you should not have more questions than answers. If I'm running a business and I have more questions than answers, then I need to seek those answers before I start adding more questions. And I think all that we've seen in the NCAA in the last couple of years is questions on top of questions on top of questions, not a lot of answers. And if the answers are there, they're vague. And vague answers might as well not even exist at times, because they're kind of like ghosts in the middle of a cemetery. It's like, okay, at what point are these even answers to our questions? Because we're not really getting anywhere with them. So you do mention the expansion of the college football playoff. That's one of the things that I think has been a huge positive in the last couple of years and change. A 12-team model, and the 6 highest ranked conference champions, 6 at-large teams. The college football playoff committee is still going to be doing their rankings as is. So when it comes to the 6 highest ranking conference champions, they'll look at those pieces of it, and then 6 at-large teams from there. That gives us a 12-team model, and it's supposed to happen in 2026. Could happen as early as 2024 or 2025. They were down in Irving. I mean, and for you, this was, a walk down the street type of thing, but the 10 FBS commissioners, including yourself, and Notre Dame athletic director Jack Swarbrick were there in Irving, Texas, here to start off right before the fall, at the end of the summer going into the fall. So what this experience has been like, and this move toward the 12, 6 highest ranked conference champions, that we would think, most people are thinking that that's going to include the quote unquote Power 5, the Autonomy group, plus that other school, or other conference. Now, the Sun Belt has worked to build itself up. You've worked to build yourself up. What are your thoughts on that? It's not a declared given. They say the 6th highest ranked conferences, but very few people think the SEC, the Big Ten, are not going to obviously be in that top 6 ranking wise. And then probably the Big 12, the ACC, and the Pac-12, there's a lot of thought that they're going to be within that. So it looks like a American versus the Sun Belt from year to year. How do you view that? What are your thoughts on it? And is there a safety net for the American Athletic Conference, or do you feel like it's kind of you and the Sun Belt to represent that 6th spot that is being opened up by the expansion of the playoff?
Well, I think you're right, Dan, that the P5, so-called P5, are likely to have 5 of those 6 slots. I mean, there was a year during COVID when the Pac-12 wouldn't have, but that's probably a very unusual circumstance. But the bigger issue for us, and it's really important, is it gets rid of that whole G5 label when it comes to the official playoff. Yeah. The official playoff involves 10 FBS teams, the top 6, regardless. There could be a year when the Pac-12 champion has 3 or 4 losses, or the Big 12 champion has 3 or 4 losses, or the ACC champion has 3 or 4 losses. And, we are the Sun Belt. Let's not forget the Mountain West. Let's not forget the others, Still think we're by far the strongest conference, and we have been, but we'll have to keep fighting to maintain that, especially we're losing some schools. But as we've dominated the decade, and we've been right there with the other 5. And the point is, we're going to be fighting in all likelihood for that 6th spot. I don't think there's probably much doubt about it. But think about it. You can now tell recruits, you can now tell your team, when you start spring practice, when you start summer practice, you've got a shot at the playoff, a legitimate shot. You might have a far better shot at the playoff than the bottom 2/3 of every P5 conference. Think about it. How many of those guys have ever had a shot at the playoff? We now have that shot. Now, there are also 6 at-larges, and that helps us all, because I'm not sure we're going to necessarily get those, because strength of schedule is a factor, and we're working on that, though. And I think, again, I want a fair shot from the committee. I don't think we've gotten that over the years. We got Cincinnati, but the year before, Cincinnati had a good claim. UCF had a good claim. We had some great teams. And I don't know how they would have been viewed in terms of, the at-larges if they hadn't been the champions. But the point is, we now have a legitimate shot, and so do these other conferences. And that's really, I think, the most critical thing. But get rid of that label. The labeling has been the biggest problem we've suffered from. The branding is critical. And yes, I think we put out a great product on the field. We still struggle a little bit sometimes with attendance, although we've improved dramatically. Our stadiums, we've had a lot of renovation and new stadiums. We've done a lot of things that we needed to do because this conference didn't have the kind of makeshift state universities that some of the other conferences have. Yeah. But it's a very good conference. It's a strong conference, and now there's hope. Before, it was tough. I mean, look, I always said we had a shot at the playoff, but I knew that it was going to be a long shot. And give Cincinnati all the credit in the world. But let's face it, if you hadn't had a bunch of 2-loss P5 champions and you didn't have a 1-inch play on the last play with Oklahoma State, I don't know whether Oklahoma State with 1 loss would have gotten ahead of Cincinnati. I would hope not, but it might have happened. So a lot had to happen. Cincinnati had to have a schedule that was conducive. They had to have that road game with Notre Dame. They had to have a game with Indiana. A lot of things had to go undefeated. Think about how hard that is. Think about how many teams go undefeated every year. Very few. How many times has Alabama gone through a season as good as they've been, as dominant as they've been, undefeated? Think about that. So our conference is good. It's a good conference. Any coach that's ever coached in our conference talks about how tough it is. It's a good conference. It's a solid conference. Look, Tulane just went over and beat Kansas State earlier in the year, gave up 10 points, right? So think about what that means. So now you have a shot every year to be in that play. We may not be, right? And some years there may be 2 conferences from our so-called group, which I hope goes away. There may be 2 FBS conferences that aren't the guys that make all the money, who actually, like one year it would have been us and Coastal Carolina over the Pac-12, right? Maybe there's a year, as I mentioned, that somebody else falls out. Not necessarily likely, especially with the committee and the strength of schedule business, but at least you have hope, and hope is absolutely incredible. And by the way, that hope means that your alumni are going to still care, that your fans are going to care, that your donors are going to be engaged. Like, for instance, if we decided we were just going to do a playoff among ourselves, remember how that's been recommended to us? Yeah. Oh, have your own G5 playoff. That would destroy us. Everybody would say you're second rate. You're not, they sometimes say that anyway, and it's untrue. It's absolutely untrue. But the point is that would just be, legitimizing that notion, because you'd be saying you're playing at a different level and you don't have access to the big championship. That would destroy our programs. The donors would say, we don't need this. Why don't we just drop to Division 2 or 3 and save a lot of money and just not even bother with this? No, we need to play at the highest level, and we need to give our student athletes, if we're going to be the kind of schools we play at that level, we want to give our student athletes that opportunity. We've fought for 10 years. And by the way, I think what this conference did, and I don't think anybody can dispute it, had a lot to do with this 6-6 model. There is no question that the American knocking on the door year after year having these great teams that we had, the UCF 25-game winning streak, the 2 years that they were right there, Cincinnati for 2 years right there, Houston was there back in Tom Herman's day.
Yeah.
If it weren't for that, Dan, I'm not sure. I really don't believe you'd necessarily have 6-6. You might well have 5-1, and everybody would have said that's fine, not an issue. So I'm proud of what the conference did, and I think it's created an opportunity. Just as 10 years ago, Dan, I had to fight hard in that room to get the automatic bid for the so-called G5 conferences on New Year's Day. I hated the idea that the Big East was being pushed out of the so-called BCS group, and now it became the P5 instead of the P6. I hated that, but there wasn't much we could do about it at the time because we were in such disarray. And so consequently, you had to salvage something, and having the automatic meant that you didn't have to be ranked at a certain level because some of our teams weren't, even though they were good enough to be ranked that high. And consequently, we've been able now to make that mark on New Year's Day year after year. We have not had a game that wasn't competitive. And by the way, our playoff game against Alabama, okay, final score 27-6, but it was 17-6 late in the game, and then obviously there were some late scores. We had 3 drives inside the 10. We played more competitively than a lot of those teams have. How many times have you seen those scores be 49-0 at the half or 28-0 before you even sat down, right? That didn't happen to Cincinnati, and Nick Saban acknowledged it. I thought that was great of him to do that. The point is, we now have a situation where, we get rid of some labels. We're trying to develop some different branding. It's going to be a tough road. It's not going to be automatic. Hope we can do it.
We look at if it were to happen today, right? If we had the 6 highest ranked conference champ, and let's just say the conference, let's say the teams that are ranked the highest for argument's sake right now, let's say these are the teams that win their conference championship. If we were looking at it right now, that would mean if we were under the new college football playoff model, Georgia would represent the SEC, Ohio State, the Big Ten, TCU, the Big 12, Oregon, the Pac-12, Clemson, the ACC, and Tulane, the American. If we're looking at the ranking right now, there is no other conference, Sun Belt, whatnot, not ranked higher than Tulane. So if that's how things were taken, we looked at our conference champions of the 6 highest ranked conferences, then that's what it would look like. Just for argument's sake, to take a look at that, that would also mean that arguably the SEC would get in of those 6 at large, 3 or 4, and then we would maybe see, another team from the Big Ten. What are your thoughts on that? If we just kind of play the hypothetical game today and say Georgia, Ohio State, TCU, Oregon, Clemson, Tulane, and in a year like this year, then maybe we would also be saying, if this was the college football playoff expansion, Tennessee, LSU, and then maybe we're talking Alabama as well, Michigan. So that's 4. And then if they took Oregon, or I'm sorry, I already had Oregon. So if they took USC, and then let's put Ole Miss in there. So then we would have 1, 2, 3, 4 more teams from the SEC, and then Michigan and USC, the future of the Big Ten, USC. So we would look at the at-large, those 6 at-large teams just coming from the Power 2, so to speak.
Well, it could easily happen that way, Dan, because again, all the old and famous brands are almost entirely consolidated in those 2 conferences now. You could argue that Clemson, Florida State, and Miami, because of their history, would be in that category. And other than that, maybe Oregon, maybe Washington, but they're not quite in that category. There's almost, those are the brands that are going to spend the most money. They're going to recruit the players. They're not always going to be the most successful. But if I had to guess, I would say that those 6 at-larges are going to be heavily populated with SEC and possibly Big Ten teams, especially with Lincoln Riley at USC and as good as they are now, and with UCLA coming on, obviously there's some strength there. On the other hand, it gives everyone a chance. There's still some teams from our league. There's some teams from the Big 12, from Pac-12, from the ACC. Mario Cristobal will probably rebuild Miami. I mean, they're struggling now, but this is his first year. Give him a chance. And Florida State, they've made clear progress under Mike Norvell, which I knew they would. He's a heck of a coach, great coach at Memphis. And then you look at Clemson, and they've slipped a little, but they're still Clemson. So the point is, North Carolina, other schools, it's going to be interesting. But what it's going to do, Dan, it's going to probably mean 24 schools are still going to be in contention as you get into October, November. That's good for college football, because now all of a sudden you're paying attention to all those schools, aren't you? And what if we had 2 undefeated teams, which, we've had at one time in 2015, very late in the year, we had 3 really good undefeated teams in Houston and Temple. And at the time, who else did we have, Dan? We had Navy had 1 loss, but Memphis, and Memphis had beaten Ole Miss in a huge upset after Ole Miss beat Alabama. And remember, that's the year Temple took Notre Dame right to the last second and could have easily won that game. Would have been an incredible upset. So we had 3 teams that everybody would have said were in the at-large pool as well, not just winning your conference. So It's going to open things up. Now, I'm not, I'm a realist, and I understand where we stand. I also understand the power of the so-called P5 schools in terms of recruiting and how they use that branding and what it means. And also the fact that they have all that money and facilities, and that impresses recruits. NIL is a factor, though. It might be a leveling factor, Dan. I don't know, because we have some schools that could, potentially end up with some serious sponsors who want to sponsor the kids. We don't know yet.
Yeah.
We don't know what the transfer portal will do. We've developed tremendous teams by having, developing great players and having maybe a half dozen great players and a whole lot of good ones and top quarterbacks. So one thing I do as an aside, Dan, I don't know that there's any team in Division I these days that shouldn't have a really good quarterback, because nobody wants to be a second string or third string quarterback anymore. There are a lot of darn good ones, and they're all going to want to play. And you see that right now. I think 40% of the quarterbacks playing are transfers. Think about that. Look at Tanner Mordecai at, setting that incredible record at SMU. I mean, he's a transfer. Caleb Williams a transfer. You go back and forth, and they're all transfers. So I think everybody potentially could have a good quarterback, and everybody also, in my view, should have a good kicker, because that's the next most important position. And we've seen that again play out this year. The kicking game is absolutely critical to football. So everybody should have a pretty good shot at those positions.
Yeah, and I think, looking at this, obviously the college football playoff expansion is going to be a positive thing, and it's going to help out, the American Athletic Conference. And like you said, not a 5+1, but 6 highest ranked, and the 6 at large, which could very well go to that power 2 and make things, really, be good for Greg Sankey and SEC commissioner, looking at a year like this, like I said, where he could be seeing Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, LSU, bunch of teams get into this and have an opportunity at it. There's something else that I want to get to before I let you go here with Mike Aresco, American Athletic Conference Commissioner, here on Wake Up Call with Dan Tortora as we head into the weekend. Earlier this week, the American Athletic Conference announced the future scheduling of you having, for the first time ever, your largest football conference in the history of the American coming right here as we head into the 10-year anniversary. You will be expanding in perfect timing here to celebrate a decade. You will have the biggest football conference you've ever had for the American, and one of the biggest football conference in the FBS with 14 institutions. The scheduling model, which was unanimously approved by all the athletic directors within the American Athletic Conference, is going to run in a format from 2023 to 2026 at least. And what we're going to see is we will see each team each season play 8 conference games, which is a norm here. Each team will face the other 13 conference teams at least twice during the 4-year cycle, which is different, once at home and once on the road. There's going to be 6 permanent matchups every season, which will be geographic connections here, as we have North Texas and SMU, UAB and Memphis, Rice and UTSA, Charlotte and East Carolina, Florida, Atlantic, aka FAU, and South Florida, and Navy versus Temple. So we are going to see this new format come into fruition. Would love to get your thoughts on it, Mike, because this new model, and it was when UConn left the conference in all sports, and you went down to 11 when it came to football. The question was, are you going to seek to expand? You and I talked about it a lot, and it was, will you go back to divisions? Well, there was a time where divisions were a necessity in order to have a conference championship, and the Big 12 had to go out there and apply for a waiver because they did not have that. So the question was basically, are you a viable conference if you don't have at least 12? Well, you had 11, you ran it with just one conference, no divisions. And then at a time where you could seek to go back to divisions, having 14, 7, and 7, like the ACC currently has, the ACC does away with their divisions and comes up with this model where they have a 3-5-5 model. Your model, similar but different, and not in the sense that you don't have the three, that permanent three that a team is going to play every single season, but you have the permanent matchup. So we will see some of these matchups happen every single year, but there's not going to be that Navy's going to play the same three teams every year. They'll play Temple, but they don't have those other two slots. But you do give the opportunity that if you stay 4 or 5 years in college football, you're going to get to see every single team in your conference twice, once at home and once on the road. How important was it to have a home and home over a 4-year span so that everybody gets to play everybody in each other's place? And so that the conference can really feel like a conference and be cohesive. And then at the same time, I'd love to get your thoughts on why you chose the 6 matchups that you chose to showcase every year, as opposed to having a group of permanent opponents.
Well, Dan, one of our goals clearly was to have everyone play everyone, because you just alluded to it. I think you said it spot on. You want to be a real conference. You want to have some cohesion. You want to play everyone. And so we set out, we have a great consultant, a fellow named Kevin Paga, who does a great job working with conferences on scheduling. Scott Draper, our previous football administrator, now Jamie Hickson has taken over for him. They worked hard to coordinate, all the research, and we realized that we wanted everyone in a 4-year period to play everyone home and away. And that's important because, you see in some of these bigger conferences where they don't play it, they play everybody every 12 years or something, it's just, or you can go 4 years and never play Ohio State if you're in the Big Ten. Well, that's one of the privileges, I think, a brand like that, playing a great program like that, and you don't get to do it. So that was important. Second, divisions didn't make any sense for us anymore because you want to have your 2 best teams playing in the championship game. With the new playoff format, especially, you have to be a conference champion to be in that top 6. You want your 2 best teams playing. If you've got potentially 2 undefeated teams or 2 one-loss teams, and we've tried to set our schedules up so that you don't end up with necessarily three teams that don't play each other, who might be undefeated. And how do you decide who's in the championship game? So there's some nuances to this scheduling that are really important. But the point is, divisions don't make as much sense for us anymore, and therefore we haven't had them recently. We didn't think we needed them now. And then finally, you talked about the rivalries. We don't have the kind of rivalries the SEC and the ACC and the Big Ten have. We're a young conference. We're a conference that's very diverse. Conferences, schools that didn't necessarily have a lot in common with each other, but we develop rivalries like Memphis, UCF, like Cincinnati, UCF, right? And some of those will disappear now. But the point is, we looked at geography and we said Temple Navy's a natural to play, annually. They wanted to. UTSA and Rice, obviously Memphis and UAB have a long history before UAB joined our conference. So you had SMU, Houston's gone now, but so you have these 6. We ended up with 6 that we felt were real potential rivalries, but they're not the same. We're not arguing that it's Auburn, Alabama, that it's Ohio State, Michigan, but you develop them, and these are important geographically. So in schedule that could work with these rivalries in place. So we don't have 2 or 3 permanent opponents. We didn't want to do that because that would mean that your other teams are just not playing. And it wasn't as though, for instance, the SEC, I don't know what they're ultimately going to do. I don't think they've made a final decision, but if you're Alabama, you've got a serious rivalry with Tennessee, right? You've got a serious rivalry with Auburn. If you're Georgia, you've got a serious rivalry with teams you really do want to play every year. You have a 130, 140-year-old rivalry with Auburn. If you're, and so consequently in that league, you have, teams that have played each other for decades. And think about it, in the old SEC, Dan, sometimes, I don't know whether they only played sometimes 6 conference games, and Alabama didn't play Georgia for a number of years. It's hard to think that that was the case years ago, but it was. And, we wanted to, avoid that. And I think the SEC is trying to avoid that. I think a lot of the bigger conferences are trying the best they can to have teams play each other. 14, we're not quite as big as the Big Ten or the SEC, but we're bigger than we've been. That was a decision we made on the realignment front. You alluded to real. Thought that being bigger gave us some strength in numbers. We thought we were bringing in really good schools that could enhance our brand. You never know what realignment is going to bring down the road. Nobody knows. So we're happy with 14, but we also know that it's going to take some effort and time to make sure the new schools are fully, everything is, everybody is on the same page. We got great schools coming in. I'm very impressed with their presidents and their ADs. And as you know, UTSA has had great success this year. North Texas is playing well. UAB has an interim coach, but they've got a strong team. FAU is on the cusp. You've got some really good program. Rice is showing tremendous. They may make a bowl. They're showing real progress. So we're bringing in some good schools, and we expect them, with the exposure they're going to get in our league, appearances with ABC, ESPN, ESPN2, ESPNU. ABC is going to be a little dicey because they've been over delivering on that. We don't know in the future whether we'll have the kind of games that we've had. I think we will, but the point is, there's going to be great exposure for a lot of these schools that haven't been getting it. To also have a little more revenue too. So I think the schedule it achieved what we wanted it to achieve, and it was unanimously voted on by the ADs. They're all happy with it. I like the balance of whom they're playing home and away year to year. And everybody gets to play in Texas, which is really important. It's one of the strengths of our conference, Dan. And one of the things that I have talked about, they talk about some of these other conferences that are challenging us. And I say, look, if we do what we're supposed to do, we should still be a top conference. We have more money than our other, our chief. If you're smart and you do things right, we have a better TV exposure and better TV deal with ESPN's exposure and promotion. They're great partners. We think the transfer portal benefits us because of where our schools are. We're in football hotbeds, recruiting and the transfer portal. Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, Florida. I mean, Alabama, you can't be in better places. We play great non-conference games. We promote heavily. Our P6 campaign will continue because obviously P5 is still being used. It's in our DNA to compete. The commitment and investment of our schools is going to continue. NIL is a wild card. Transfer portal is a bit of a wild card, but when you're in Texas, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, you're in the right places. So I'm confident that schedule will help us, that everybody will be happy with it, and we'll see where it goes.
That coming from the commissioner of the American Athletic Conference, Mike Aresco, giving us a ton of information on the heels of the schedule release for 2023 through 2026 and everything with the college football playoff, as well as what we're looking at around the climate for the future of collegiate athletics, what it's going to look like and what it's going to feel like. Mike, as always, I appreciate the time, how candid you are, how much information you're always willing to give. And for a decade of you and I getting to have these conversations, you've always given me the time, you've given me the respect from the beginning, and I can't thank you enough for it. So I do appreciate it, and always great to have you here. I hope there's some good news to continue to come up, and very happy. And I was told a long time ago, the day that Willie Fritz was hired at Tulane, he was standing in, again, same room that I was talking about, the arm in arm when you and I were talking. I forget who I was speaking with, but I was standing off to the side and Willie Fritz was in front of me. And they said to me, hey, look at that guy over there. They said, that guy right there, he's won everywhere he's gone and he's going to win here. And Willie Fritz brought them back to be a bowl team. And now Willie Fritz has got him in the top 20 and putting themselves in a fantastic place this season. So I'd be remiss if I didn't thank you, as I always do, for your time and all of the information you're willing to give, and just our bond that we've had over the years that I appreciate so much, you know, this free way of information that you always allow me to share. And then at the same time to say a big shout out to Willie Fritz and all the work that he's put forward, because awesome guy, awesome place to coach, awesome city to be in. Love the people down there, and couldn't be more proud for the Green Wave as they're rolling their own wave down there in Louisiana.
Yeah, I can't say enough good things about Willie. He is a great person, a great coach, and he's been a great coach for a long, long time. And, you know, last year was completely deceptive. They started off and played Oklahoma to a draw, and the Oklahoma players said no team hit harder, you know, and they played a great game. And then the hurricane, you know, hit, and they had a lot of close games. You know, last year they lost to UCF 14-10. And Gus Malzahn was talking about how good that team was. So they gave Cincinnati a good game. I'm very thrilled with their progress and what they're doing, because it's a great program. Willie's a great guy, as you said. I'm going to be at their game with UCF this weekend. That should be a terrific game. They should have a full house. It should be really exciting. And, you know, again, Dan, congratulations on your 10 years. And again, we're approaching that anniversary, and we're really pleased about it. But thank you for all the coverage, all the goodwill over the years. It's meant a lot to us. And I'm always happy to be on your show. It's also nice to be on a show where somebody is as knowledgeable as you are, so we can talk about the issues. And I appreciate the opportunity. So again, you know, if I don't talk to you, have a great, you know, Thanksgiving holiday, and, you know, maybe we'll get together before the holiday season, but if not, you know, have a great holiday season as well. Thanks for having me, as always.
Yeah, we'll definitely be talking, and we'll have plenty, hopefully, to talk about here, as UCF is having a nice final year in college football inside of the American Athletic Conference. Cincinnati's putting their work forward. East Carolina has gotten better. They are bowl eligible. Houston's knocking on the door of that. And there's some other teams that are working to get there within all of this with Tulane. So I'm sure we'll have plenty to talk about, a lot of fun to be had. And we know that there's going to be a conference championship game coming up very soon here too. So excited for that, and excited for all of these teams that are facing each other right now, because there's a really good chance there's going to be a warm weather American football championship game, and I need that. So that'll be good.
And it looks like there might be, based on well, you never know. And I don't know if Cincinnati would qualify as warm weather should they make it, but we're all playing each other. So it's going to be very dicey, but I do think we have the best teams. And, you know, you know, I'm just thrilled with all of them. You know, as you know, teams that are leaving, it's a little bittersweet, but we're thrilled for their success. I just enjoyed myself at Cincinnati so much last year. So proud of what they did. And it should be a great finish with a lot of great games coming up. Thanks again, Dan. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mike.